And you'll kick it off,
Are
right,
we live?
Katie? It is,
Yeah,
I think it's
it is live.
live.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Satya. Hey, everybody. My name is Katie, and I'm a national organizer with the 350 Canada team. And today I'm going to be co-hosting the How Radio Shows Can Be Our Movement's megaphone training. This is a training that we ran last week, but due to technical difficulties, our recording wasn't something we wanted to upload. So Ati and I are re-recording it now, and we're really excited to share these learnings in a more condensed format. So Ati, I'll pass to you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Atia. I'm the Senior Digital Specialist for the Canada team at 350.org, and I'm really excited to share our learnings with you about how we can use talk and radio shows as our megaphone. It worked really well for our federal election campaign here in Canada in 2019, and I really hope that this tactic might work for you in your campaigns as well.
Awesome. All righty.
Before we begin, it's really important for us to acknowledge that we are speaking to you from Indigenous lands, from stolen Indigenous lands. I am joining today from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish First Nations, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations out on the west coast of Canada. And it's really important to also acknowledge that we are joining you from February 2021, and this is Black History Month, and it's really important for us to recognize the history of the lands that we're on, to recognize the original peoples of these lands, and also to recognize the Black history, because these histories are often erased, and it's so critical for us to understand these histories in order to build truly inclusive and justice-oriented movements.
Thanks so much, Atia. And yeah, I'm calling you all from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe land. And this is where my family has been for generations. And yeah, it's important to just reflect on how do I benefit from the settler colonial state, and how has our history and legacy impacted Indigenous peoples of these lands. So appreciate you starting us off that way, Atia. Okay, so to go over what we're going to cover in this session, we're doing the welcoming and opening. We're going to talk a bit about why stories matter. Then we'll do a tactic deep dive. And then we'll talk a little bit about framing the just transition, because right now our campaign work is really focused around a just transition. By the time you're watching this, it might be a totally different focus, but we hope that it's useful for you to be thinking about a just transition, and also just thinking about the ways that this might apply to your work.
Before we begin, I really want us to recognize that storytelling is at the center of this tactic. We think that storytelling is a really, really important way to bring people into the movement, and to basically address a lot of the feelings that—
Atia, sorry, 1 second. No, the audio isn't working.
Oh, is it working now?
Can you try again?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Technical difficulties, we can't escape them. So as you listen to us, we just want you to think about what kind of emotions you feel when you face some of the really overwhelming crises that we're facing right now, including climate change, the global pandemic, the economic recession. It's often that these kinds of global crises elicit feelings of fear and hopelessness, inertia, self-doubt, apathy, isolation. These are really difficult and complex emotions, and we think that the best way to counter these emotions is with hope. The crises we face are overwhelming, but we also have the ability to change what's possible, and we can do that through social movements. And in order for us to really bring people into our movements, we need to tell them that story. We need to tell them how we can overcome these feelings and these crises by banking on hope, and by acting together. And one thing that it's important for me to recognize as well is, like, hope is not just something that we sit and wait for. It's something that we build by building our movements. It's something that we build towards. And hope is also one of those things that mobilizes us. So this is a quote from Marshall Gans: "In order to deal with fear, we have to mobilize hope. Hope is one of the most precious gifts we can give each other and the people we work with to make change." And it's also really important to recognize that often in progressive movements, the people that were up against, the big companies, the right-wing politicians, these are groups that are using fear to mobilize people. They're telling people that, migrants are bad or minorities are bad, and that's why people should act or people should do a particular thing. And our message is always one of hope. We counter fear with a message of hope, and that's how we want to mobilize people and build a better world. So we'll talk more about storytelling in a little bit, but before we do, I just also wanted to touch upon a case study that's very close to my heart, and a case study that reminds us why stories are so incredibly important. So a while back in 2018, one of my friends from my undergrad, Lujain Halthul, who is a women's rights activist in Saudi Arabia, was arrested, and she was arrested without charges. And it was and the reason that she was connected was because she had been a major advocate for women's rights in Saudi Arabia. She had actively challenged the driving ban against women. She had actively challenged the male guardianship laws in Saudi Arabia, and because of her activism, she was targeted and put into prison. And I remember just feeling so overwhelmed in that moment, because we didn't understand what was happening. We were really hearing these horrific stories about what might happen to Lujain and the other women's rights activists who were arrested. And at the same time, the media wasn't properly covering Lujain's story. The Canadian media wasn't paying attention to the story at all. And we didn't really know what to do in that moment, but we felt that the only way that we could really make a difference was by telling Lujain's story and telling the story of how we knew Lujain, and also using our stories to counter kind of the mainstream silence around this issue, as well as challenging the narrative that the Saudi kingdom was building around this issue as well. So around the time that Lujain was arrested, the Saudi kingdom was actually ending its driving ban against women. And the royal family in Saudi Arabia was taking credit for ending the driving ban instead of properly crediting Lujain and the other activists who had fought for it. And one thing that had happened is that Vogue Arabia had done this like big cover shoot with one of the Saudi princesses and credited her for trailblazing a new path for women. So what we decided to do was tell an alternative story of how, while the Saudi kingdom was being praised as being progressive, our friend Lujain was serving time in prison for fighting for the very things that the Saudi kingdom was being celebrated for. And we wrote this piece. We did our own alternative photo shoot in front of a car with shirts calling for the freedom of the detained activists, including our friend Lujain. We published the story in Teen Vogue, which was kind of a more progressive version of Vogue Arabia. And then later on, throughout the last 2 years, we did multiple things to keep the story of Lujain in the public spotlight. And because of the work that we were doing, a lot of media coverage began to happen organically as well. Like media outlets are paying attention to the story, and the Canadian media in particular was paying attention to the story as well. Previously they hadn't, but because we were able to tell a story of how Lujain was connected to us and had been a fellow student of ours, while we were at UBC, the Canadian media kind of saw that link to Canada. During this summer, actually, Lujain's family hadn't heard from her for multiple months. So we did a global campaign where we called upon people to just lift a sign saying, "Where is Lujain?" And this kind of attention resulted in her having contact with her family again. And ultimately, because of the spotlight we were able to bring to Lujain's case, she was eventually freed. We played a small role in this. We just told her story. We weren't the only ones doing this. Her siblings played a big role in continuously telling her story. There were people around the world who continuously told Lujain's story. And because of the public spotlight that this brought to her case, she was actually released finally on February 10th, 2021, which was 1,001 days after she was initially arrested. So this was a really great reminder about how our stories can actually make a difference, and how our stories and the way that we tell them can drive change.
Thanks so much, Atya. This was some of the most powerful campaign work that I've ever seen happen, and just feel like very happy for Lujain and all her friends and family that she will be free. So Atia just laid out the really clear case of why telling our stories can be so powerful. And so now we're going to shift into another really interesting case study. And this was from the campaign that Atia and I worked on with hundreds of young climate activists across the country in 2019. It was called Our Time. And during the campaign, what we were trying to do is make climate an election issue, the main election issue in Canada during the 2019 election. And one of the ways that we wanted to do that was by targeting the CBC, which is our national public broadcaster, and calling on them to host a federal leaders climate debate. And so one of the ways that kind of emerged through the campaign in terms of putting a target on the CBC, but also telling a really compelling story about why climate needs to be on the agenda, was this radio call-in show tactic. And so we're going to get into that a little bit here. So why did radio shows emerge as a tactic that we wanted to engage? This was really interesting and something that Atia pulled out. The average adult in Canada listens to 14.6 hours of radio content every week. But even in light of that, mainstream media often fails to report responsibly on climate justice, on environmental and social justice issues. And so even though people in Canada are listening so much to the radio, they're not actually getting the critical information that they need on really important issues all the time. Another reason was that we each have our own unique lived experiences. And as people who care about climate justice, our stories really matter and deserve to be heard. And so this can be a way that we can get our stories heard and our movement work heard about to all these people that are listening. The other thing was that it's simple. It doesn't take a ton of capacity for organizers to make a huge impact and to reach potentially millions of people. It's also what we call an evergreen tactic, which means we can use it again and again in our campaign work. It can be used on a lot of different kinds of campaigns. So it's really something that if you have the kind of recipe for, you can bring to lots of different areas of work. And the other reason is because we don't have billions of dollars like corporations, like fossil fuel companies have, like right-wing and political elite have to spend on ad campaigns. So this was a creative way, again, for us to really reach that broad audience that is so important and that needs to hear about climate stories in a way that didn't cost us a penny. So this is what happened. In July of 2019, CBC Ontario Today had a segment that was asking, is climate change factoring into your decision of whether or not to have children in the future? Our Time organizers in Toronto alerted each other and started dialing into this show. And two members actually made it on air, two people named David and Monica. They shared their personal thoughts and challenged the CBC to host a leaders debate on climate, tying the theme of the show directly to the action the broadcaster could take. And later on, in that segment, someone who'd been listening actually called in to express her support for a climate debate after hearing Monica and David speak, which was really cool. So we saw this play out. It was so powerful. And that's why the folks of Our Time in Vancouver decided a few days later to do the same thing when they found out that the BC Today host wanted to know what role climate change should play in the 2019 election. So it was setting us up perfectly for this discussion about needing a leaders debate and needing climate to be the central issue of the election. For that show, multiple young organizers were selected, including Kate and Avery, who you can see here in the photo. So pretty incredible response again from that tactic. So I'm going to pass to Ati in a second, but you know, the biggest call-in show, or probably the most listened to call-in show in the country, is the CBC Cross Country Checkup. So this is every Sunday. It's a bit of a Canadian institution. And we had a feeling that with all of the buzz, certainly around the election, but specifically around climate in the summer of 2019, with wildfires that came on the heels of really intense flooding, that we had a feeling that in the weeks to come that climate would be on the agenda for Cross Country Checkup. And sure enough, it was. So we actually, Atia set up a click to call, which made it really easy for people all across the country to click, and it would call directly into the show, and they could try to get in the queue for the Cross Country Checkup. And what was really cool is multiple people were able to get on the show and talk about climate to a national audience and call for a federal leaders debate on climate to Cross Country Checkup. So I'll pass it off to Atia to give kind of a summary of what we accomplished.
Yeah, so like Katie said, overall, our campaign goal was to make climate an election issue. And then there was one part of this campaign where we were calling on the public broadcaster CBC to host a leaders debate on climate change. So there were various moments in this campaign arc, and we're just going to go through a few of these moments, so a snapshot of the overall election campaign arc. But essentially, we started off the campaign with rallies outside CBC offices calling for a leaders debate on climate. Then we launched a petition and we collected thousands of signatures in support of a leaders debate on climate. And then we decided to escalate pressure. So we decided to go big and make sure that our story and our demand for a leaders debate on climate was heard by thousands of people across the country. So we started off by just ensuring that, we would have a space to we started by kind of creating the opportunity for us to do radio takeovers. So we began by tweeting at CBC call-in radio shows and calling and hosts for these call-in shows, calling on them to make climate an issue for one of their shows, one of the discussion topics. So we pressured these hosts. That resulted in some action. So it resulted in some shows like really addressing this demand and making climate the topic of their call-in shows. The first one was, of course, Ontario Today. So they held a show that was specifically dedicated to a climate topic. Katie mentioned it earlier. BC Today was next up. And then finally, we worked our way up to the Cross Country Checkup, which also held a show that was dedicated to climate. And with all of these shows, we staged these interventions. We had, dozens of people, if not hundreds of people calling into these radio shows, trying to get in to tell their story and to reach, an audience of thousands, if not millions across the country with our message and our demand for a leaders debate on climate. And the result was that, so many people did hear our message, and it helped us ensure that climate was at the center of the conversation during the election. And it actually pushed for better coverage of climate in the election by mainstream media, which led to climate being at the center of the official federal leaders debate. Even though we weren't able to secure an official climate debate with all of the federal leaders of the major parties in Canada, we were able to ensure that climate was a big discussion point and at the center of the debate. And it was the most common theme in the federal leaders debate that took place a couple of months later, which was a huge change from the 2015 election when climate was barely mentioned in the leaders debates.
Yeah, it's like, it was it was still frustrating because the content wasn't what we wanted, but yeah, just night and day compared to, from 2019 to 2015. I just love the tactic too, because, we think we talk a lot about our strategic targets, but we're also targeting the public. Like, we want as many people as possible thinking about climate, and we want it to be on people's minds, and we want people to be talking about it. So how do we do it? We're gonna now get into what are the steps you can take in your own organizing to employ this kind of a tactic. And this is also what you can expect when you get involved with the 350 Canada Organizing Network. This is what you can expect in our campaigns around a just transition and the election. We'll definitely be using this tactic again. So this is how it's done. So Atia is going to start us off, and we're going to kind of do rapid fire back and forth on the different steps.
The first thing is, if you're planning to do this tactic, if you want to use radio shows as a megaphone for your movements, it's really important to be on the alert. So to kind of pay attention to what kind of topics these radio shows are covering, and whether Yeah, whether they've announced their topic ahead of time. So a lot of the times these shows will announce their topic on their social media platforms or on previous episodes. They might hint at what the next topic will be for future shows. So it's important to pay attention to that. It's important to kind of like know the landscape where you will intervene, and yeah, and just pay attention to the show if you're a regular listener. And the cool thing about this is that there is also opportunity to shape the conversation. And I mentioned this earlier when I was going through our escalation arc for this campaign, but you can intervene and you can try to influence what the topic might be for this radio show. So you could tweet at the show, you could tweet at the hosts and let them know that you're interested in a particular topic. Often you can point them to headlines if you can kind of indicate that this is an important public conversation in this moment. Like for instance, right now, it's an important and relevant conversation that the government is potentially going to hand out billions of dollars to airline companies. So like major bailouts for big corporations that are also contributing to the climate crisis. So you could kind of point to the fact that there's an important public conversation happening around something and ask them to host a radio show where people call in and share their thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. And these hosts are looking for that kind of input, right? Awesome, Satya. So the next piece, and bear with all of the Schitt's Creek gifs on these slides. If you're not a fan, you should become one. But prepare what you want to say. So write down a few key points about what you want to get across to listeners. And going back to what Ati was saying at the start of this session, is we really want to find a way to best resonate with people. And so what we need to do that is be thinking about what's called our public narrative. So your public narrative has 3 elements. There's your story of self. So getting across to listeners who you are and what makes your perspective important. Are you a young climate striker? Are you a grandparent who has grandchildren and are concerned about their future? Are you a school teacher? Are you a nurse? Are you seeing the impacts of climate change in your community? Think about your story of self and why this issue is so important to you. Then think about your story of us. So what is the issue at hand? How does it affect your community or our larger community in this country? And why is it important? And how can people come together to overcome this challenge? So that you could relate, the idea that we need a federal leaders debate on climate because we need our politicians to reflect the urgency of this crisis and show that they're willing to do what it takes to confront the crisis. That's one way of thinking about it. The story of us could also be, in relation to the just transition is if we don't act on the just transition, there are going to be a lot of people in our communities who are going to get left behind. And the fossil fuel companies are going to walk away and take their profits to offshore tax havens. So the story of us is really, really critical to share. Like, how does this issue affect your community? And then the story of now is what the listener must do, what the target must do immediately. What is the call to action? So for us, for the Just Transition campaign, our call to action is really for the federal government to commit to show that they're going to move forward the legislation that they promised in 2019 for a Just Transition Act for workers. And so we can share that, and we can also share to the listeners that if they feel the same way, they can get involved with this campaign. So you might want to share a link or a hashtag, some way for people who are listening to be able to follow up and get involved.
Yeah, and the next step is just calling early and calling often. So often with radio call-in shows, there are a lot of callers. There are a lot of people that regularly listen in that are eager for their opportunity to weigh in. And so just remember that the earlier you call, the better. So as soon as the host says, start calling, make sure that the phone number is on your phone and ready to go. maybe start listening to the show with your phone in your hand, ready for that moment, and just continuously keep calling. So it's possible that you might not get through the first time. That's completely normal. Just keep on trying. If you hear a ring, then just don't hang up, stay on the line and just wait for someone to come through to you. And this is like part of the fun of it, is just like throwing your name in the hat, like just trying to see if you can get in, if you can get through. And it's just a matter of like consistently trying. And the more people you have trying with you, the better chances you have for someone in your movement or in your group to get through. So the best part is just like, you know, you're doing this together, you're sharing the experience together. So make sure that as many of you as possible are calling in early and continuously calling. Yeah. And if you want other people to join in, like maybe make it as easy as possible for them to join in. Like maybe there are some people in your group that don't feel as comfortable. So you could, you know, if they're not comfortable speaking, you could have some like speaking points ready for them that they can refer to as well. So they feel comfortable calling in.
And I think we didn't share this on the last session that we recorded for the Satya, but one lesson that I think is really interesting is that it's actually easier to continue to call if you just have the number on your phone. And we learned that through the click to call feature or tool that we had, is that the click to calls aren't actually set up to be able to call over and over again. So I think, and maybe this is my assumption, but I think if we did this again, we would simply share a phone number to people who we wanted to be activated, as opposed to setting up a click to call. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And yeah, having it saved on your phone ahead of time probably makes it easier to continuously keep calling.
Yeah, nice. So all things we learned through just trial and error. So the next piece is, if you do get through, you know, don't hang up and get on the phone with the call screener. So the call screener is basically the person who is in between you and the radio show host. So they help to identify who are the people that are going to make it through to actually talk to the host. So you're going to have to make your case about why you should be the person who makes it on the show. This means communicating really concisely who you are, why your perspective matters, and the kind of angle you want to take. You can also offer to be a resource for the host, and this is going to increase your chances of getting on the air. So you could do this by volunteering to answer a specific question or cover a topic that was raised by another caller. So yeah, responding to another caller, or, you know, if the host has posed like a follow-up question, those are all things you can bring into it. And just be prepared to share your name, location, and your phone number. The other piece of this that's really important is to get through to the call speaker. You really want to be short and to the point. They've got a lot of calls to sift through. So just, yeah, try to be clear, concise, and to the point with them.
I don't think I need to tell anyone this, but you should reduce your background noise. We're in the age of Zoom. We're on a lot of phone calls these days. So I think we all know what it's like when there's a blender in the background or a vacuum cleaner in the background. You definitely want to be in a quiet room with the door closed. Your roommates or your partner or your parents, whoever knows not to call you. If you're listening to the radio while you're calling in, just make sure that the radio is off so that the sound of the radio isn't coming through on the phone call. And if you know that your computer audio isn't great, maybe use a headset, maybe use headphones. But if you know that your headphones don't always result in a very clear connection, maybe don't use those. So just use whatever you need to do, use whatever you need to like just have like a very clear connection. Maybe sit next to a window or somewhere where you have a really good signal on the phone call as well. You just want a very clear connection. You don't want there to be any background noise. Again, you know, the screener is considering a lot of different things. And if they find that your connection isn't clear enough, then maybe even if you have a great story or even if you're making a compelling case, they wouldn't want you to be on the show because your connection isn't clear enough. So just keep that in mind and reduce background noise, have a clear and smooth connection.
Another one we probably don't have to tell you is to be polite and be calm. So the reason we bring this up is because sometimes it can be really frustrating to hear what other people have to say, and that can get your emotions going before you're even on the air. And sometimes it can actually be the hosts themselves, like maybe it's the way they're asking questions. Yeah, if it feels hostile at all, it may elevate those kind of emotions in you too. But just remember who it is you're trying to resonate and connect with. It's the audience. It's the people on the other end of the connection who are listening to the radio. And so you want to be compelling, and you want to be just someone who they can really connect with, and they likely won't do that if you and the host are being combative, or if you're being hostile to another caller.
Another thing is just get to the point. Don't tell a winding story. You don't need to tell multiple stories. You just need to make your point, make it simply, make it clearly, get to like the action item that you want people to take if you're coming in with an ask that you have for people, and let the host pick it up from there. So maybe it might be helpful for you to have a couple of speaking points written out ahead of time. It might be helpful to just practice what you're saying ahead of time so that you can keep it as tight as possible. Remember, of course, there are so many people calling in. It's also important to create space for other voices. So just make sure you have a clear strategy for coming in, coming out, just like getting your point across. And although, it's important to have speaking points written out, it's really important to speak from the heart and for it to sound authentic. So try not to speak from a script, because people can really tell when you're doing something that's like heavily scripted. Use your speaking points as a reference, but don't like read off of them word for word. And again, practicing ahead of time really helps with this so that you're not coming off as like a scripted caller.
Yeah, totally. And this is kind of connected to the one I shared before, but hold your ground. If the host interrupts, just firmly and politely say, "May I finish my point?" If the host tries to take you off point, becomes aggressive, or insults you in some way, just stay calm and restate your point. The best thing we can do is just make sure that we're getting across the things that are most essential in our message, and not letting the host interrupt you or sideline you, because this can happen.
We've talked about it before. The big piece around telling the story of our movements and of any sort of social movement is to really have a very clear action item that people can take and run with. So be really clear about what kind of change needs to happen and what role the listeners have to make that kind of change happen. So make it very clear what they can do in this moment to take action on this issue. People are often compelled by a story, but as we mentioned earlier, we don't want to tell another story that leaves people sad and hopeless. We want to make sure that anyone listening to the story is compelled to take action and feels hopeful about the issue as well. So definitely share where people can find out more information, or if there's an existing campaign, let them know how they can join the campaign. Give really clear instructions on how they can take action. And it could be as simple as, maybe writing to an elected official, or maybe you just want someone to talk to a friend or a family member about this issue, because that makes a difference as well. It's really important to change the hearts and minds of people across the country, if we want to take action on a lot of the really big, overwhelming crises, like the climate crises that we have in front of us. So just giving people a very clear action item can go a long way, and it can, bring more people in for the long run into our social movements for change.
Absolutely. Most of all, don't get discouraged. The reality is most people who try to call are not going to make it on the air, but we can still cheer on and celebrate the people that you organize with who do, and even the unknown callers that you don't know who make it on the show, who share your vision or who decide to call in because of what you shared. There's a lot to be excited about when doing this kind of a tactic. I just wanted to share this really quickly to give you a sense of the kind of energy that was alive when we were doing this kind of a tactic. And so these are screenshots of the conversations that were going on in our Slack space, which is a chat tool. And it was just so positive. Everyone's cheering each other on, communicating what other call-in people who called in were saying. Like communicating what was happening basically, and just like giving each other a lot of love. So in whatever way you communicate with the people that you organize with, just make sure there's a really cool space that is energizing and celebrates the success that you all have.
And group chats are a great way to coordinate as well and be in community with each other. So like, you can let people know that you're calling in now or that you got through. And like, it's better when you're all doing this together and it doesn't feel like you're doing this in a silo. It can be more encouraging to keep going if you know that other people are maybe making it through or getting their point across. So yeah, group chats are great. Really recommend it. And it could be anything. It doesn't have to be Slack. It could be on WhatsApp or it could be an SMS thread or Signal.
Totally. So we're actually not going to listen to this recording right now, but we're going to share with you at the end a bunch of additional links that you can follow. And we do encourage you to check out the recordings of the cross-country Checkup recording and these different CBC radio shows that we have linked, just for you to get a sense of like what it was like during these calls and how organizers like Kate, like Monica and David that we mentioned earlier, just how compelling it was, the stories that they shared and their calls to action that they shared. So won't share it now. We did share it on the last training, but you all can access that right after you watch this. So one of the things that we did on the previous training was that we had people break out into groups and talk about messaging around a just transition. What we're going to ask you to do as people who are viewing this on YouTube, maybe later on, is to get out a notepad and paper and write down the answers to these two questions. One is, who are my people? So who are the people that you're organizing with? Who are you in community with? And what is the issue that we're facing? So this could be anything. I mean, you could be part of 350 Canada's Just Transition Act or election work. So those answers might be a little bit more clear for you. You also might be doing like a local grassroots campaign in your community. So think about who are the people you could activate through a tactic like this, and what is the issue you want to be talking about. And then, yeah, reflect on some general questions about that. So I have these framed right now as in relation to a just transition, but you can tweak them based on the issue that you're thinking about. So what's your stake in the issue? What does a just transition look like and who does it serve? And who are the power holders in this and what are you calling them to do? So yeah, basically we're going back to the story of self, us now. What's your stake? What's at stake in your community? And what is the urgent call to action? So write those things down. Maybe you'll want to like co-create a messaging tool for you and the people that you organize with on your specific campaign issue. If you're interested in the just transition work specifically, we were able to break out into small groups and talk about messaging and framing for a just transition. So we'll actually be creating a tool that we'll be able to share with folks soon after, and we'll post that in the caption for the YouTube video once we have it. So yeah, just to get you kind of primed on what the campaign work is around a Just Transition Act. Basically, in 2019, Justin Trudeau promised that his government would bring forward a Just Transition Act and create a million green jobs in an effort to transition off of fossil fuels. Since 2019, we haven't seen anything happen on that. And when Biden canceled Keystone XL, which was a really important and critical move for the climate, there was a lot of conversation about what does this mean for workers in the oil and gas sector in Canada and all of the, spin-off economies and frontline economies. So we launched a campaign calling on Justin Trudeau to finally deliver on that promise in this really critical moment. And what we believe is that what that policy looks like, it really is so important for it to be fair and equitable and put people first, especially workers and communities that are most impacted by the fossil fuel economy. It's got to mean green jobs for all, so a green job guarantee. And this is so important in the context of growing inequity and rising unemployment, especially in the pandemic. And, as grassroots organizers across the country, we don't just want to be focusing on our target. We also want to help communicate this message that it's imperative the federal government provide the opportunity for meaningful support for workers and communities impacted by the transition. So we want to share this message of why a just transition is critical and how it fits within this bigger context of a Green New Deal for Canada. So again, here are some, if you're really interested in just transition storytelling, here are some prompt questions that can help you kind of think about how you would frame this issue, and we'll share more resources on it. All right, so I think that's all in terms of framing our work. I'm going to hand it over to Atya to share some of the next steps that you can take.
Yeah, really excited to talk about next steps. So reflect on this tactic. Think about what we've discussed here, and think about if it could apply to the campaigns that you're running in your community, locally where you are. If you do end up using this tactic of calling into radio shows en masse with your story, let us know. We'd love to support you. Maybe we can amplify on our social media channels as well. So just feel free to throw us an email at 350canada@350.org to let us know how this campaign tactic could be relevant for the work that you're doing. And we'll definitely use this tactic, as Katie mentioned, in our election work. So, in the slide deck, there is a link to our volunteer form, which is at 350.org/Canada/volunteer. So just fill out this volunteer form if you are interested in learning more about the Just Transition Act, and just in general, if you're interested in getting involved with campaigning for climate action in Canada. And dig into additional resources that are offered in these slides. So we're going to pass around, we're going to post the link to the slide deck in the description for this video. So just check out the slide deck, and in the slide deck, there are a whole bunch of links, including links to audio clips of the stories that people told on the radio shows that we discussed earlier. There's a blog that details a lot of this tactic and like what it looked like for the Toronto group that used it. So I'd really recommend checking out these resources. There's also resources on storytelling. Yeah, it's just that, yeah, this slide deck is just packed with resources. So really recommend it. And give us feedback. So we'd love to know what you think of this training. If you'd like other training similar to this one, if you have any questions, feel free to email them to us as well. So our email again is 350canada@350.org. So just send us an email, and we'd love to get back to you and share more information about radio takeovers. We obviously just love to talk about it. So ask us as many questions as you like. And reference information, again, if you go to the final slide, or yeah, I think it's the second last slide. A lot of the resources I mentioned are linked in this reference info slide. Yeah, thanks very much. It was so great to connect with you all on YouTube Live. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to the original session that we had on Zoom. We're really excited to be in this movement with you, and we're really excited that there's so many groups that are interested in creative tactics for moving social change.
Awesome. Thanks, Atya. Thanks, everybody.